On this day, 1974, Muhammad Ali defeats George Foreman in the most famous fight in boxing history, the Rumble in the Jungle.
Foreman with that right. Ali's falling with a split pass. A good right. Backs up Foreman. Backs him up in his back. Foreman's selling it. Foreman tries to look. Ali's thrown to the right. Foreman comes back to the left. Foreman hit again. Foreman has been hit 3 or 4 times. Misses a wild left hand. Ali showing tremendous strength. Holds the ball. Ending round 5. By far the best round of the fight. We'll have a replay.
And we're back, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of this, hopefully, happy hump day evening here with me in New York. Once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Today marks 50 years since what is generally regarded to be the single most famous fight in the history of professional boxing, or any boxing for that matter. And that would be what is known as the Rumble in the Jungle. Now, it's possible that some of you have heard the phrase Rumble in the Jungle and didn't Google it or don't know exactly what it means, what it represents. But the Rumble in the Jungle was a world heavyweight, in every sense, boxing title fight between the champion, the undefeated Olympic champion in 1968, who had just pretty much not only ran through the Olympics of Mexico City, but ran through the heavyweight division and obliterated a legitimate all-time great in Joe Frazier. And then he crushed Ken Norton. He beat a guy named Joe Roman, who was pretty good, a top contender. And that would be the champion, George Foreman. And the challenger was, at the time, still a polarizing figure in the United States, not really around the world, specifically to the United States. Himself a former Olympic champion, a gold medalist, and a former heavyweight champion who was, well, we can just say it, he had the belts unfairly taken away from him due to his stance on his actions during the Vietnam War. And that, of course, is Muhammad Ali. And the two guys ended up fighting one another specifically because Ali beat Ken Norton in a return fight. And Norton ended up getting a title shot against Foreman anyway. I never understood how that worked. Kenny had beaten Ali in early 73, broke his jaw. Tough fight, split decision. But most people feel that it was deserved that Kenny kind of outworked him and outpointed him throughout. And then Ali defeated Joe Frazier in the second fight between them. Frazier had famously won the first fight, the so-called fight of the century, another really tough fight, went the distance, but most people felt that Joe was a clear points winner, especially because he scored a knockdown in the final round to kind of put the capper on it, because it was a close fight. But if you're in a close fight and then you suddenly have a 10-8 round, well, the person who scored the 10-8 round is going to win that close fight. But Ali was tough, and he was the kind of guy that 3 of his losses, his career proper, he should have only had 2 losses, but he ended up with 5. It was more because he just kind of kept going way past where it was. He really shouldn't have even been let in the ring. That's a whole other story. But the 3 losses of his career proper, the first to Frazier, the second to Norton, and the third to Leon Spinks, he ended up defeating those guys in the return fights. And George Foreman liked Ali. He was a huge fan of his as a fighter, as you would expect. But George looked at the Ali fight as a fight that he wanted to take, and he didn't see the 1973-74 Ali as particularly dangerous because he knew that he was slower, that Ali was nothing like the kind of dynamic fighting force that he'd been in the 60s with the incredible speed and the defensive capacity, the kind of radar sense that he had where he was able to swivel his head and body away from punches. A little bit of a Floyd Mayweather without the shoulder roll. He was more hittable in the 70s, still really fast, but definitely more hittable. And George's kind of what he saw as an ace in the hole, and he wouldn't have verbalized this because there wasn't any point. People could figure it out for themselves. He beat both guys who had beaten Ali, and he beat them both very easily. Neither fight was competitive. He took Norton out in 2 rounds. He took Frazier out in 2 rounds. And it was Don King, the Don King, only in America Don King, who put the fight together. He kind of, I hate to say he did a Don King, but he sort of horseshitted his way through, where he made it seem as if he had guarantees that he didn't until he was able to actually get those guarantees. To be more specific, he told George Foreman that he had $5 million guaranteed if he agreed to fight Ali, who was legitimately the number 1 contender by virtue of his having defeated Norton in the rematch with him and defeating Frazier in a rematch in January of 74. But he told Foreman, I've got $5 million for you guaranteed if you want to fight Muhammad. And George said, well, Don, I don't really know you that well, but that sounds great. Let's do it. Then Don went to Ali and said, champ, I got $5 million for you if you agree to fight George. So he was full of shit, but he also knew if he could get both guys to sign, and he did, he was going to be able to raise the necessary funds. And they ended up, because it made the most financial sense. And there was an idea. This is not criticizing anybody, or I'm not being condescending or saying, oh, well, of course, or something stupid like that. But the fact that, it's like in 75 when Ali fought Frazier in the Philippines. There was always a sense with Ali in particular that he was a global citizen. And he was still a very young man at the time that the Foreman fight was signed and that it went off. He was only 32. He's a very young man. Yeah, he'd had the wars in the ring and the battles with the establishment. He could have gone to prison for 5 years. The Supreme Court ruled in his favor, and that obviously was a big thing. The Supreme Court ruling unanimously. It was a very conservative, it was the Earl Warren Court, and that helped to kind of restore his standing among some people. There were those who still said, no, I'll hate this guy forever or whatever. But he was somebody who had fought overseas in the 60s, and he had Irish roots. That seems crazy, but a great-grandfather, I think it was actually a great-great-grandfather on his mom's side, was from Ireland. So there was a sense that he was more than just a fighter, that he was a global citizen. And with all of that in mind, it turned out that General Mobutu, who was, he was maybe one notch above Pol Pot. This guy was a dictator, a brutal, bloodthirsty dictator. But Mobutu made a really significant financial offer to host the fight in his country of Zaire, which had been called the Belgian Congo, and I think now it's called the People's Republic of the Congo. I'm not 100% on that. It's one of those where it might be called something different depending on where you are. But the fight was set, and the general sense among the kind of intelligentsia of fight fans and sports writers is that we were going to witness the end of Ali. And there was a kind of sadness to the writings of certain, like the Larry Merchants and some of the newspaper columnists, Robert Lipsyte, who were fans of Ali. And you're not really supposed to be a fan when you're a journalist. We know this. There's not supposed to be any, because not that it's a conflict of interest, but it kind of is. You're supposed to be impartial. But there were a lot of journalists who were very, very much a fan of his, that they felt that he stood up for a lot of people who didn't have a voice, all of these kinds of things, which were all real. It all happened. But there was this idea that he should not take a fight with Foreman, that George was going to hurt him. And they already knew that Ali was the kind of fighter. We saw the way that he was able to absorb a lot of big shots from Frazier in the first fight and just keep moving forward, and even getting up from a hellacious left hook that probably ends the fight almost any other fighter in history, and he's up at the count of 3. There was a sense that with whatever was in his wiring that made him the way that he was, and this was already a perception, there was a chance that he was going to take a battering that was not okay. That he had such pride and he had such courage, and that he had something within that was going to make him want to continue to fight, even if he was unconscious, he was still going to stand there with his arms up, and he was not going to quit, and that somebody was going to have to basically pry him off, or he just was going to go. Like, there were people worried that he was going to die in the ring, as it seems insane. But George was a fearsome, and he himself was a tough competitor. George was a much greater, pure competitor than people ever knew, because when you have seemingly easy fights, it's tough to tell just how badly you burn to win. But George Foreman, as it turned out, burned to win just as much as anybody who ever held that belt. So there was this fear, and also this kind of elegiac sadness that this great man who got fucked by the system, somebody who put his money where his mouth was in every sense, was willing to spend 5 years of his prison and never box again for a stance that he absolutely believed in. And that was the whole thing with the Supreme Court. Nobody could say that. You could say he was wrong for his beliefs, but you couldn't say they were not sincerely held, and that he wasn't willing to give up his entire livelihood and his life for what he believed in. So, as the fight approached, as the summer of 74 turned to fall, there were more and more people, including Ali's, at that time, close friend, the great telejournalist Howard Cosell, who was one of the first Monday Night Football. He was the play-by-play, and he was terrific on baseball as well. Cosell was he was a character. He rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. He had a very unusual cadence and canter to his speech, but he was one of the best to ever do it. He didn't want Ali to fight Foreman. He just wanted him to retire. He said, look, champ, you're not what you were. There isn't any reason for you to do this. You can't beat this guy. And it's a little bit like you were Rocky III, Rocky IV, and Stallone, who took inspiration from Ali's fight with Chuck Wepner for the Rocky saga in the first place. There was inspiration in Rocky III and Rocky IV that you can't beat Clubber Lang. And you sure as fuck can't beat Ivan Drago. But Ali had that something that can't really be explained. Because it's not enough to say that he thought he was going to win, because every great athlete, every fighter, you don't go to a fight to lose. You go in because you believe, I'm going to beat this guy. And he was convinced, I know how to beat George. Yeah, he's a scary fighter. We know he can punch. But he hasn't faced someone like me, even with the understanding that the Ali of 1974 was not the Ali of 67, but he was a bigger man physically. And in theory, he knew that Ali could take a hell of a punch, whether to the head or even especially to the body. He believed that he could absorb the best of what George was going to throw, but he was going to be able to tire George out. And another thing with Ali is his cardio was off the charts. Now, some people would say, yes, he did road work, but they all did road work. But then Ali also had something that can't really be explained, in that he seemed to have a motor that should have been on empty, and it never seemed to be on empty. So he was, I believe, he didn't say this out loud, he was gambling on the fact that regardless of Foreman's road work and his cardio, that Ali would be able to outlast him. That he would, because he took such a good shot, he'd be able to get George into deep water, and it wasn't him who was going to drown, it was George. Now, the other thing that happened, the fight was supposed to go off in September of 1974. And according to Angelo Dundee, Ali was in very good condition, but he wasn't as sharp as he could have been. And what Dundee would say is the absolute best condition that Ali achieved in his comeback, when he came back after the exile period, was the second fight with Norton, where he was as lean and mean as when he was a kid in the 60s. And by kid, I mean, I'm saying when he was 25 in his prime, like that. I just say kid because he looked so youthful. Ali was in good shape, but he wasn't quite there. And with the fight about a week, maybe 10 days away, George suffered a cut in sparring. And it's not that the fight was ever going to be canceled, because there was too much, I hate to be cynical again, but there was too much money involved. But Dundee said that that extra month, while George healed up, and, George was upset. He wanted the fight to go off and get it over with. He figured he would probably win, in 2-3 rounds maximum. He didn't want to. Knowing George, he probably said, just let me go out there with a cut. I'll take him out early. But I don't know that he really said that. But the time between George recuperating from the cut until the actual fight night, which was October 30th, 1974. Because if you look at some of Leroy Neiman, the famous Leroy Neiman painting of this fight, about this fight, which I had, the original pressings show, I think, September 27th as the fight night, and then it's kind of almost scratched out, and then it says October 30th. But Ali got into just about the best shape that he was capable of getting into at that particular time in his life. And he connected with the citizens of Kinshasa, which was the name of the city where the fight was being held. Excuse me. And then he changed his plan. Ali changed his plan from, I'm going to try to tire George out, I'm going to take this guy into deep water and I'm going to drown him. I'm going to beat him late. And Ali said, you know what? Everyone's expecting I'm going to move around. I'm going to try to keep distance with the jab. Maybe I get lucky, open up a cut. But Ali said, no, we're not going to do that. He didn't tell anybody his plan. But he went out there that night, and his goal, he wanted to knock Foreman out early. This is a thing with Ali that people have said over time. He always seemed to know what tools to bring to a fight. And yes, he had a lot of different things he could do. And most fighters, they don't have a lot of different things they can do. But he decided, even though throughout training that was not the plan, I'm going to go out and see if I can take this guy out in the first round. And obviously he didn't. He didn't hit hard enough. And George, in his own right, took a hell of a shot. And so Ali went out in the first round, and he's throwing right-hand leads at George, which is unbelievably disrespectful on top of anything else. But it also opens him up, meaning Ali, he could get hit with a huge counter. Maybe George could get him early. You don't know. But Ali showing the ability to do something completely different than he'd ever done in any fight in his career. It put the idea in George's head, not for the first time in an Ali opponent's career, this guy's nuts. What the fuck is he doing out here? It wasn't until some point in the second round that Ali went to what is commonly referred to as the rope-a-dope. Because he hit George hard, but he didn't hit him hard enough. He did not rattle him. He did not daze him. George walked through some of Ali's best shots. And Ali squared him up, I think, 3 times in the first round. They were the kinds of punches, if George is landing them, the fight might be over. But George was really tough, and he kept moving forward. So that's when Ali said, I got to do something else. And the rope-a-dope, he didn't train for that either, is what resulted. Now, the kind of myth of this fight, this is a very important point. The myth of Ali Foreman, of the Rumble in the Jungle, is that Ali, realizing he couldn't simply run around the ring and outbox George for 15 rounds. It's easier said than done. He laid on the ropes, let Foreman wail away, absorbed a lot of shit, a lot of punishment. George tired himself out, and Ali rallied. Now, there's some truth to that, but that's not really. If you watch the fight, Ali looks like he's in command for almost the entire way. He's not just on the ropes. He is on the ropes looking for openings, and he is landing clean, big shots. He's not throwing pitter-pat punches. He's landing combinations. And yeah, George is hitting him. He's hitting him, but he's not really hitting him clean the way he just landed one bomb on Frazier and Norton after another. He only squared Ali up a couple of times with shots to the head. There was actually one punch which didn't appear to have that much concussive force, but which actually spun Ali's head around. I think it was the 3rd or maybe the 4th round. But he didn't land that many big shots to the head. And it was not until the 5th round that people really started to get the idea whatever Ali is doing is working. And you don't want to make predictions. George is undefeated, but it's looking like Ali is going to win this fight, as crazy as it seems, because people were surprised, some people, that they're still throwing punches at each other in the 5th round. George tells the story that I hit him with absolutely everything in the 5th round, and he always called him Muhammad. He said, I hit Muhammad with everything, and I didn't miss. Yes, he blocked certain shots, but I outsmarted him a few times, and I got my hooks into the body, and I know I hurt him. But he just had a look on his face. When I think back on it, the look was saying, You can't hurt me, George. You can't. And so there is a moment, and it's really incredible to watch, where George, who was known as a guy who was a plotter, he was not a plotter. He had unbelievable footwork for a guy his size who didn't appear to be particularly fleet of foot. George tricked Ali. That was something not easy to do, where he leaned one way, Ali defended his right side, and George landed as hellacious a right to the body as anybody could possibly land. And he landed that shot, and Colonel Bob Sheridan, who was doing the main commentary, screamed, "Vicious right." Almost any fighter in history in that exact position other than Ali, at the very least, they're taking a knee. I'm not saying the fight's over. They're taking a knee. And maybe they're on their knee for the next 5 minutes. We don't know. But George landed this shot, and he almost seemed to back up, wondering why the guy is not going down or what's happening. Did I not hit him as hard as I think I did? And then Ali looked up. It was probably a couple of seconds of torture. And somehow he looked up and he said, "Is that all you got?" And George later, half jokingly, in multiple interviews, he said, when he actually said, "Is that all you got?" That's the moment I knew I wasn't winning the fight. Because that indeed was all I had. I could not have hit this man any harder than I did. I tricked him. I wasn't going to be able to do that again. And he stood up to me. And Ali dominated the exchange towards the end of the fifth round. There was 30 seconds left in the round when George almost ran out of gas. He was almost collapsing from hitting him so much. And Ali rallied. He pushed back off the ropes, landed a couple of huge shots, and pretty much George was finished. He didn't quit. He's still throwing punches in rounds 6 and 7. Didn't win either of those rounds. But Ali went out there in the 8th round and landed a combination and a big right hand, but not really a knockout kind of a punch, a big right hand. And George kind of spun around and went down. And, there's a lot of talk about referees, some of them having faster counts than others. I got to tell you, I think Zach Clayton maybe had the fastest count in history. But George got up. Zach was at 8, and George is on his feet, and Zach Clayton, the referee, is waving the fight over. I always believed he simply stopped the fight because he didn't like what George looked, the look on George's face. He looked like a fighter who had enough, even if he's on his feet. Now, I don't know what Zach said. I've never heard him say, "Yeah, I reached 10," because the announcer, and it appears that Clayton is at 8, George stands, and Zach goes like this. After the fight, there was no commotion. There was no rage from Foreman's corner screaming about what the fuck happened with this count. You guys, the man is saying 8 and my fighter's on his feet. Nothing. And many years later, Archie Moore was asked about that. They said, it looks that Zach is counting 8 and George is standing up. You guys didn't say anything. What was going on? And Archie Moore actually said, it might as well been 10. The fight was over. There wasn't any reason for it to continue. George wanted to go, but he had shot his bolt, and he just wasn't winning the fight. There was no, you say this in politics, there was no path to victory. There was no path to victory for Foreman that night because George had landed everything he had, especially to the body. And Ali just kept moving on him. He kept moving forward, and there was just nothing. George could not win that fight. And there was there was no reason for it to continue. Sorry, I'm going to turn the light on. And that was, I don't know that it's necessarily one of the greatest fights. It's one of certainly the greatest event and the most famous fight in boxing history. But in the career of Ali, certainly you could argue the first and third fights with Frazier were more exciting, more tactical, lots of back and forth where one guy appears to be in control and then the other guy, and especially in Manila, it was really difficult to score Ali fights. But he ended up winning. And then as I recently spoke about, a documentary filmmaker named Leon Gast shot a ton of footage of Ali in the lead up after Foreman suffered the cut to the fight. And 22 years later, he was able to finish the film with new interviews with George Foreman and George Plimpton, the author, and Norman Mailer, among others, He was able to complete the film, and it won the Best Documentary Oscar at the 1997 Academy Awards. And it was actually Will Smith who presented the filmmakers with the award. And Ali and Foreman, they were great rivals, but they were even better friends. They were sitting together at the Oscars, and the filmmakers wanted them to come up on stage and share the award. When We Were Kings, that's the name of the documentary, if I haven't said. And it was really a beautiful moment in history. And there is something to be said for great competitors in a sport like boxing, a warrior sport, who all those years later, no, they were just doing a job. Those guys didn't hate one another. Each guy was trying to win for pride, for himself, for his family, for history. But when it was all said and done, at the end of the day, when Muhammad Ali passed in 2016, George was one of the first people to say something about it. And he said, "I've lost a piece of myself, the greatest piece." Truer words were never spoken. And George, for all of his achievements, what a humble man. What a humble man. And somebody who was never happy about the fact that he lost that fight. But he was always willing to talk about it. And he was always proud to have shared the ring that night 50 years ago today with Ali, and took part in one of the most important worldwide athletic events that has ever taken place. 50 years ago today, October 30th, 1974, the Rumble in the Jungle. This has been episode 345 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your, hopefully, happy hump day evening with me here in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.